Hello, everyone. I am Ευθύμιος Papatsikis, and in continuation to my other presentation on brain development and why we need to know about brain development in kindergartens, I would like to share with you this time in this presentation the framework of what we call developmentally appropriate practice. So I have used specifically for this presentation this great book that I will share it with you on my notes, and you can of course buy it. It has a lot of information and of course more detailed information from what I'm about to share with you right now. And the idea of this presentation, of course, has to do with understanding the wider framework of the developmentally appropriate practice, what it is, how we conceptualize it, how we can practice it in the kindergarten environment, and what would be good practices or wrong practices for that matter. And I hope you'll see the value behind this kind of very specific framework that connects what we discussed last time on brain development of infants and toddlers at the very beginning of their lives as of their education. And in this essence, now with this presentation, we are going to discuss the framework that a teacher or facilitator, as you'll hear me saying many times, can actually use and conceptualize so that they can provide a more efficient experience to children in the kindergarten. So let's first try to describe what is developmentally appropriate practice and seeing through this position statement, as you can see it on your screens, first of all, what we can say is that developmentally appropriate practice is all about creating a caring community of learners within the context of relationships in the classroom. So here we have two specific ideas to consider. First of all, we have learners. That's as a second part. They develop relationships between themselves. And in this kind of community of learners, relationships play a huge role in development. So the first thing we need to realize about the developmentally appropriate practice we're about to analyze is that learners form relationships. The second thing would be that the developmentally appropriate practice, or DAP, as I'm going to refer to it from now on, is all about enhancing development and learning with a consideration of teachers' roles and strategies to support children's learning processes. So it means that basically what we are trying to understand through DAP is how we can create the teachers' roles so that in the best possible way, so that we can support the children's learning processes. Now, it's all about, of course, constructing appropriate curriculum, and we need to pay attention to both content and strategies. So it's binary, the attention we have to keep in mind always. It's not only about the content, how we create the content. It's not only about the strategies, how we use the strategies we have in mind. It's how we integrate both of them into providing a more efficient and more enriched environment in the kindergarten. Then, of course, it's about assessing children's learning and development. So it means that whenever we actually provide specific information, experiences, activities through the DAP approach, we don't just rest on providing them, we try to assess them as well so that we can see if what we are offering is appropriate to the population we have in front of us. Then, obviously, to a certain extent, we always try through DAP to establish reciprocal relationships with families. So basically, what we mean by that is that we don't just try to create an enriched environment and stay at that level. We always try to communicate this environment with the families. We try to get information from the families on to what extent this kind of environment works, and we try always to be in constant communication to see how we can improve, enhance, refine our practice into the kindergarten environment. Now, if we try to provide a wider definition of what is developmentally appropriate practice, we could say a lot of things, and DAP cannot be defined in a very specific way with just 2 or 3 lines where we just say a few things and that's it. What I can offer, however, in this case is this wider framework of how we understand developmentally appropriate practice in the environment of the kindergarten education. So, first of all, DAP is based on what is currently known and understood about children. So it's about the knowledge and the understanding of this kind of knowledge. So the first thing we need to remember is about evidence. It's an evidence-based approach by itself. It is a framework, a philosophy, or an approach, as I have already referred to it up to now. And this kind of framework, philosophy, or approach, it needs to be embedded in the practice of the teacher that practices this kind of specific approach or thinks that needs to use this specific approach in their practice. Of course, as I said before, it includes assessment methods. And most importantly, it tries to find the correct balance between professionals' knowledge and parental and community expectations. If you remember from my previous presentation, I said that the systems from the bioecological model, they interact with themselves, and of course the child is benefited from this kind of interaction. So we have the microsystem that is interacting with the mesosystem, and the exosystem is actually interacting with the other 3 systems. If you remember, if you bring in mind the specific idea of the framework of the bioecological model. So in this case, what we are trying to understand here is that the developmentally appropriate practice approach, it's all about finding the balance in between these different systems that encompass the bioecological model. As teachers, as facilitators of knowledge, is our mission to understand this kind of balance and try to refine it for the benefit of children. What are the essential components of DAP? Let's try to see them quickly and try to understand them, because in order for somebody to be able to practice that, or at least encompass it as an approach, then at least we need to understand what are its essential components. So first of all, I have already said that is the actual evidence-based knowledge that derives from research, and it has to do with child development and learning. So it's a twofold approach that has to do both with development. That's why my previous presentation focused on the developmental side of things, and most of all to the brain development. And then, of course, it has to do with the learning processes and the learning ideas that we try to implement in the kindergarten environment. Then a second essential component of DAP is it's the individuality, if I may say, of the child compared to the greater group that we have inside the kindergarten. Of course, having said that, we're not trying to say that through this specific approach that we forget the group approach, that we tend to forget that there is a group in front of us whenever we teach, and that we shouldn't consider the group as a group. But on the contrary, what we say is that the individual person is also important, and it's important for the teacher, the facilitator, to understand and be responsive to individual variations, so that the group can benefit from this kind of individual variations. The teacher tries to understand each individual child, understand their needs, understand how they can be approached in the best possible way, and then trying to integrate these kind of needs to the greater group needs, and obviously trying to understand them as of the curriculum design for the greater good of both the individual and the group together. Now, the third essential component of DAP can be what is known about social and cultural contexts in which children live. I've said already about knowledge, which is evidence-based. I said about the individuality going along with group teaching, group experiences, and so forth. Now, if we extend the DAP approach through these two specific elements and essential components, we see that society and cultural contexts play a huge role into implementing what is called developmentally appropriate practice. So it's not only about knowing what to implement or understanding the knowledge, the evidence-based knowledge. It's not only about understanding the individual or the group and how we can actually manage to provide more efficient education, but it's also about understanding the bigger picture that has to do with culture, understanding society for the benefit of the children in the kindergarten. So, what are the results of developmentally appropriate practice? And consequently, what are the results of the developmentally inappropriate practice, if I may say, whenever we don't follow, that's the simplest way to say it, whenever we don't follow DAP by itself. On the positive side, of course, we have self-esteem, regulation, and uplifting. So whenever we follow DAP in the kindergarten context, we can be sure that we uplifting self-esteem, because we provide the fertile ground for the child to create the stable basis to support their own self-esteem. On the other side, whenever we actually try to avoid developmentally appropriate practice, we create holes in what we call the self-esteem building up. And then we start seeing individuals not being ready to face risks, exploration, and so forth. Now, of course, self-esteem by itself doesn't mean that much unless you have self-control. And the second important thing that we get as an outcome from DAP is the balancing or controlling ourselves. So self-control can be seen in many variations, especially in the kindergarten environment, where kids don't really know how to control themselves. And just because of this specific fact, it's more important to use a specific approach that gives them the opportunity to develop it, develop self-control, know how to handle it, and use it whenever it's needed, or leave it to be free whenever they can really go out and explore and try to risk in order to learn. for that matter. So self-esteem and self-control, obviously they go hand in hand. What is a byproduct of these two, I might say, and it's a result that can be seen into the DAP approach by itself, is stress. And when I say stress, it can be stress control or stress balancing. We do know from the neuroscientific evidence that mild stress helps learning, helps development. So we need to have mild stress in the educational environment so that someone, the individual, can be activated in the process of learning and in the process of developing themselves. However, what we can achieve with DAP is that we can provide a stress balance framework where the individual can see the differentiations in between the stressful events, and they can understand intuitively or not, or consciously, they can understand when that exceeds specific expectations. And most importantly, in this case of kindergartens, the kid, the child is not capable 100% obviously to understand this kind of balance. So the teacher that applies this kind of developmentally appropriate practice needs to consider that stress plays a huge role and always needs to be considerate on how things develop as far as stress is concerned. Then the last part that we get as a result, as an outcome of developmentally appropriate practice, is that we favor later academic patterns. And what do I mean by that? We actually create more specific environments, educational environments that bring specific structures that we are going to meet later on in our educational life. In the very beginning, we don't know about mathematics, we don't know about grammar, we don't know about how we can communicate history and so forth. Now, the most important thing with developmentally appropriate practice is that we create specific academic patterns by giving hints, if I may say, that follow up later academic patterns, and therefore we prepare in a way the child to be ready to accommodate this kind of future academic patterns and be more susceptible to specific ideas into further education in the later stages of their lives. So it's important to understand that these are the positive outcomes, if I may say, or at least the outcomes of developmentally appropriate practice. And whenever someone chooses to follow that, I can say that they need to have all four of them into their mind and consideration so as to achieve a good enough result that can bring positive developmental trajectories later on in life. Now, many people, based on what I said, might have already created or might known from before specific elements that are debated about developmentally appropriate practice. So we can see in literature that there are a lot of misunderstandings about what DAP is. And let me just clarify for your own practice and for your own convenience what is not DAP, so that you can avoid it or at least understand whenever something goes wrong, as of these things I'm about to analyze, you can avoid them and try to find other paths of implementing what you'd like to implement in the classroom. So first of all, we do know for DAP that there is not only one right way to carry out developmentally appropriate practice. So people that they think that there is only one right way, and you expect from me right now to tell you the specific approach to practice it, then you're wrong. And the reason for that is that we don't really look for specific features to implement inside our practice in the kindergarten. On the contrary, we try to understand the big picture. We try to understand the facts that actually are connected to development and learning. And based on these facts, we try to create something like a warehouse of tools that will help us in the future to choose the best possible practices, tools, ideas that we can implement into the classroom and then give the best possible experience to children. So there is not only one right way to carry out DAP, and I would like you to keep that in mind. Many people think that developmentally appropriate classrooms are unstructured. So it means that in order to achieve the best possible development, we just need to leave kids free to just play without having anything else in our minds. That's again wrong. There should be, to a certain extent, a specific path we follow so that both ourselves as facilitators of knowledge as well as kids, children, understand how things develop and follow this kind of path to benefit. There is, of course, as I said, and you'll see, I will be repeating it. I will be repeating it many times. We need to be flexible for DAP to be effective, and of course, how do we achieve flexibility? By having as many tools as we can get, so that we can be flexible in what we practice inside the classroom. So again, what is not DAP is that teachers teach minimally or not at all in the classrooms where they apply the DAP approach. There are many people thinking that whenever we are discussing about development, no, I mean, it's only about what biology brings up, and teachers that just sit there just to be aware of safety issues and just help children develop by themselves by activities that they have nothing to do with it. That's a wrong impression. Obviously, DAP has much to do with how we interact with children, and we are going to analyze it in a while. So the idea of these kind of programs where we try to apply DAP don't have academics as of their nature and their framework. It's also wrong. I mean, I said before that it's all about having specific patterns to follow that brings us later on to this kind of skills level where we can abide to all these kind of skills that have to do with reading, writing, and arithmetics, and so forth. So a developmentally appropriate practice environment and curriculum doesn't mean that it doesn't offer this kind of academic skills. On the contrary, we always try to give specific details that bring this kind of linkage in between what we do now in the very beginning of the kindergarten and as seen later on in the later academic life. Of course, again, here we need to discuss about balance, and we are going to discuss it, how you offer this kind of patterns of academic skills and so forth. But still, there is this kind of misunderstanding saying that most people don't think that we do have this kind of patterns inside the DAP approach. There is a strong belief from many people that whenever we're discussing about DAP, then we refer only to special populations. That's again wrong. We are not discussing only about special populations. Development refers to everybody, to every single kid, to every single child we are going to teach. And it's wrong to believe that whenever we are discussing about developmental appropriate practice, we are referring to specific populations that they need it the most. Then we have the classrooms that in this approach people say it's impossible to understand how children learn. That goes hand in hand with what I said before, that the classrooms in DAP are usually, what people believe, are usually unstructured in nature. That's how it should be. And I said that that's wrong, of course. The same thing happens here on what I'm about to explain, that we do understand, we do have learning products to assess, to investigate, to understand if something goes wrong, and so forth. So the developmentally appropriate classrooms, they do have specific paths to follow in terms of the learning process and assessment. And it's wrong for someone to believe that whenever we're discussing about developmentally appropriate practice, these do not exist. There are thoughts about DAP to be very specialized in nature as of what we use inside the classroom. Of course, what I can say here is that developmentally appropriate practices, they don't focus only on a specific amount or type of tools we use, toys, props, and so forth, and materials. And the only reason for that is that we have so many variations of development and so many needs for development from the side of the children that it's impossible to have specialized toys, materials, and props to use inside this specific approach. So what I'm trying to say here is that it's wrong to think that whenever we are discussing just for development and we bring in the discussion development, then we are talking about specialized approaches. As I said before, DAP is not about specific populations. Even here, I would like to repeat or extend this kind of discussion by saying that the idea of having specific kind of toys, props, and materials is wrong for DAP. Again, it's a misunderstanding when people think that developmentally appropriate practice doesn't have goals and objectives. I said before, again, that we need to have goals, specific goals and objectives to follow. We need to have ideas in place. The matter that shows we are flexible in changing this because we see different reactions, or we try to assess and effectively feedback the process of learning, doesn't mean that we abandon completely the goals and the objectives. On the contrary, we have them, we acknowledge them, and then if need be, we just change them so that we can manage a more effective educational environment. Again, extending this one that has to do with development by itself, there are many people thinking that the curriculum is based only on development. So whenever we're discussing about developmentally appropriate practice, then we are only discussing about development. And most people, whenever I give this kind of presentations, they tell me, oh, so basically, if we know about the brain, that's it. No, I mean, that's not true. I mean, knowing about the brain, and that's why I'm starting with this kind of information. It's one of the basic things, especially for the beginning of life, because that gives us the opportunity to understand how the system works. Nevertheless, it doesn't mean that we just focus on development by itself in the essence of brain development or biological development, because biological development and brain development goes hand in hand with social development, cultural development, relationships, emotional development, and so forth. So that's a misunderstanding about DAP, thinking that it has a curriculum that it's focusing only on child development. And then last but not least, I mean, there is this kind of new trend saying that, DAP is just an idea that has to do with new trends, that it's all about understanding neuroscience, understanding about development in general, and then we need to abandon the previous approaches we have in mind, and then that would be wrong because this is just a trend that will pass either way, and that won't help us in our practice. Well, actually, I think that DAP is not a trend at all. It's what our system as of general development, if you'd like to see it in terms of the body, in terms of the brain, in terms of relationship, in terms of emotion, is already established even before we decide to just write it down and create this kind of approach and just try to explain it. So I think it's not just a trend. It's something that it's viable of understanding it for our practice. It's very important to understand it because then we can understand the different variations of what we can expect and how we can handle these kind of variations. And I think it's very, very important knowledge to keep in mind whenever we are entering in the environment of the kindergarten, where we actually have so many fragile systems, as I call them personally, to handle, and they're still interconnected. So it's not only about discussing the brain or discussing emotion or discussing relationships. I see them as a whole. And I believe that just by reducing the importance of DAP towards that level, saying that it's only about development and it's just a trend, brain development, and it's just a trend, then I think that's wrong. It's not something that we need to confuse with just this part of science that discusses brain development by itself. I mean, here we're trying to integrate more things in one place, and everything needs to be translated, everything needs to be brought into the kindergarten environment so that we can offer a more efficient and more valuable and more enriched environment for the children we are helping to learn and grow up. Now, whenever we are trying to approach and create environments that they are based on developmentally appropriate practice, we need to have in our minds the cycle of planning, as I call it, and is this kind of cycle of planning is very important as a guide, as a driver, if you say so, that brings us from the conceptualization of the developmentally appropriate practice as a concept to the actualization of the actual activities that we bring into the classroom. So first of all, what we need to do when we are planning to implement developmentally appropriate practice, we need to keep in mind that the observation comes first in order to learn about the individual children that we have in classroom, as well as about the whole group. We need to see the different dynamics here. We need to understand the different dynamics. So we need to observe the different dynamics. It's a completely different thing to watch a child play inside a group and we focus on a specific child. And then it's a different thing to see how this child develops connections with the rest of the group and how the group interacts with the specific child. So observation is one of the most important things you need to keep in mind whenever you start developing concepts that have to do with DAP and generally with your practice, I might say. Then the second step has to do with the assessment of where each child is in relation to the predetermined goals and objectives we have in mind. So we bring, whenever we try to implement specific strategies into the classroom, we always bring ourselves as teachers, as facilitators, specific goals and objectives to implement and try to achieve. But then again, it's all about understanding where the children we have in front of us, where they fit as of these goals and objectives. So we always need to assess if there is a balance in between the two. In order to do that, the third step is to actually learn about the needs, the experiences, the interests, and what questions children have on what we are about to implement, how we are going to implement it, and so forth. Obviously, this cannot be done from the very beginning, and I'm not suggesting that this is something we can follow with a great detail, especially in the younger ages, because the feedback we get might not be verbal at all, for example, conscious or even meaningful sometimes. But then again, looking behind the lines and trying to understand how children react to what we offer them, then that's an indirect feedback that we can rely on in order to formulate our objectives and our goals. So developmentally appropriate practice is about, as I said, up to this point, observing, understanding where children we have in front of us fit in the model we have in mind in terms of the curriculum, in terms of the goals and objectives, then learn about how they could interact or how they see this kind of idea of our objectives and goals, for that matter. And then after collecting all this kind of evidence, then this is where we actually start deciding our strategies, materials, and so forth. So basically, what I'm trying to say here is that in practical terms, whenever you go inside the kindergarten classroom, don't just start and just implement what you have in mind and what you bring in with you because somebody told you something about it. Of course, prior knowledge is important. Of course, prior experience is important, but then again, you always need to be dynamically predisposed to what you have in front of you. And this cycle of planning helps you understand what is needed in a specific classroom. And this is, in essence, what we can call developmentally appropriate practice, for that matter. Obviously, you cannot rest just as of yet in terms of what you've done. This is it, and you finished. You just leave it by itself to be inside the classroom. You need to evaluate what you've done, how you've done it, and then reformulate whatever is happening if needed, or refine so that you can get a better outcome the next time you use the same strategies or the same curriculum or the same approaches. And this is again the essence of how we visualize, how we understand, how we feel about the developmentally appropriate practice. So the cycle of planning is the very essence, if I may say, of how you can actualize practically what we call developmentally appropriate practice. Now, let's try to be more specific, because many people up to this point might say, yes, but this is theories. This is, okay, this is, we understand it, but what is the idea you bring to us in order to understand what is developmentally appropriate practice, and how do we differentiate what we do already, or what we already apply into the classroom from what you're trying to say. So let's see a few things in more specific terms and try to compartmentalize whatever we have in our mind on DAP, trying to explain in three different levels: the one that refers to infants, the one that refers to toddlers, and the one that refers to preschoolers. How specific principles apply, and what we can do with this kind of principles in order to create classrooms that will be more efficient and more enriched for the benefit of children. So let's start with the infant DAP approach. And the first thing I would like to share with you is actually the principles that are embedded into the sensory motor development. We know that in kindergartens there are children that they start very early in this educational environment, from their 8th month after birth, especially here in Norway, and they continue for a few years until they get into the school environment, the formal school environment. Now, in the very beginning of life, there are specific axioms we follow in terms of development, and we do know that up the second year of life, children, they focus mostly on what we call the sensory motor development. So, what is sensory motor development? Is the one that focuses, interacts with, or relies on how we understand our sensory environment, the environment that we feel around us, and how we move ourselves. That's why the component motor exists there. How we move ourselves in this environment. So, how can we understand developmentally appropriate practice into this kind of more specified approach of the infant DAP approach, and what are the principles? First of all, the first principle you can follow is that relationships is the most important thing you need to uh, bring up into such environments as the kindergartens. It's not about, I mean, most people say, yeah, but let's try to enhance, most importantly, the sensory motor idea. So let's bring a lot of different information to children. Let's bring them toys. Let's bring them ideas where they can actually explore, especially when they're very, very young. But they forget that in order for learning to take place, you need viable and you need secure relationships. So the first thing is all about creating secure and right relationships with your children in the kindergarten. Then it's all about interacting with them. That's the second principle. You need to have interaction. And interaction doesn't mean that you always talk to them. Interaction means you are there and you try to interact with them whenever they need you, or just by standing next to them, because this makes them feel safe, and they actually understand that they can expand a bit more without risking too much. This is how learning happens, and so with this kind of interaction you provide them, then you bring the best possible results you can get. Of course, it's about, as the specific title says, it's about sensory motor experiences, and it's about touching, feeling, exploring in space. And of course, it has to do with the playful side of things. So it's all about playing. Then we need to favor repetition in this environment, and repetition is important, especially in the infant stage of development, for many reasons, including biology, including self-esteem, self-control, as I said before, and so forth. So remember to repeat whatever you're offering to children in terms of experiences and activities. There should always exist a sequence on how you actually do things and how you repeat things, because that brings safety into place. And you need to remember, as a seventh principle, that learning is unique to the learner. So there is no one fits all approach, meaning that if you offer something in terms of a learning experience, it doesn't mean that everybody will grasp it in the same exact way. So try to remember what I said before about having the individualized variation in your mind, and try to make experiences unique for each of the learner, be it in terms of your relationship, be it in terms of the enriching of the process, being in terms of providing space for exploration, or whatever that might be. In order for all this to happen, obviously, to provide a learner center approach, obviously, you need to leave the infants to take the lead. They are young, they are very young. Sometimes it might not seem that they take the lead, but believe me, so they do take the lead, even if it's not something that you can see, and if it's not something that you can feel or understand. So don't expect to see what you could do or would do in certain situations, but always try to provide faithfully, if I may say, space for the infants to lead whatever you are about to experience in the classroom. Leave them be, leave them try, leave them understand in their own ways. And if you take a diversion in what you had in the very beginning in mind, let it be, because this is where development happens. Then, of course, returning to our side, to the teacher side, that I call ourselves facilitators, we provide the world to children. We don't transfer knowledge. We don't make them download a bunch of information and that's it. Forget about this kind of idea if you ever had it in your mind. It's all about offering what exists out there in the best possible way, facilitates access to this one that makes sense, the best sense to the child that we have in front of us, and then leave them to experience, leave them to live the moment, the situation, the sequence, whatever that might be, the experience in total. We are not here to impose, we are not in the classroom to create specific bundles of knowledge or ideas that they need to accept and absorb. We are there to offer opinions, offer variations of what can be learned, so that according to the needs of the individual learner and the group as society, they see the benefit out of it. And that starts from very, very early in life. Obviously, we need to have communication for that matter to happen, so always invest into communication. Now, what would be the strategies, the right strategies in order to implement DAP for the benefit and growth of infants at that level of the age range, as we said? We're talking, I repeat, 8 months to 2 years old to 24 months. So, first of all, we need to create the physical environment for exploration. Remember, it's all about sensory motor experiences, it's about understanding, it's about exploring the sensory motor world. So we need to have a physical environment capable to provide experiences on exploring and understanding sensory motor facts that we make them our own knowledge when we are infants. So it's not only about the philosophical side of things, it's about the actual physical environment that we need to create. Then it's all about the socio-emotional environment that needs to be there for exploration. As I said already, if a child, if an infant doesn't feel confident and safe to explore, then there is no exploration at all, so there is no learning. So there is no DAP for that matter. Always remember that sensory motor ideas, sensory motor experiences go hand in hand with social emotional environments. And this is something that you need to see connected in your practice and whenever you are designing curricula for that matter. Then remember to always consider the cognitive match, as we call it in psychology. What is cognitive match? Is the situation where you understand if what you offer is enough, or if it goes to a certain extent off the limits of a child's capabilities. So, for example, sometimes we think that children don't pay attention because they are absorbed from something else, or they don't want to pay attention to what we are offering them. But the truth is that, especially at that level of the infant age range, they don't have the system ready to pay attention. So here comes the cognitive match as an idea, and we need to be ready to understand if what we offer is matching the cognitive capabilities of the child. Not because they cannot create this kind of capabilities. We do know that children, they can learn very fast. We do know that they can actually absorb things very fast. But sometimes there is a mechanistic limitation that prevents infants from understanding things or interacting with things. And especially for the infant age range, whenever we're discussing about DAP, cognitive match is a huge idea that you need to keep in mind. Obviously, you need to keep in mind, of course, observation as a great tool for this kind of environments. And having said that, if you don't observe, then you get into the process of creating inappropriate practices. So, for example, if you stop observing what is good for the physical movements of an infant, meaning that you are restricting the physical movements of an infant, then you start creating inappropriate practices in your classroom. So always remember that restricting the physical movements of an infant is an inappropriate approach. The same applies to sensory exploration for infants. So physical movements leads to sensory exploration. So if you deprive children from one, then you are depriving children from the other as well. Then sometimes we are overdoing it and we are providing super stimulation or overstimulation, as we call it. Now that's a huge debate about what is called and what it is actually to be overstimulation. Some people they see it in terms of biology, some people they see it in terms of emotion, some people see it in terms of ideas that have to do with the wider social environment, as of introversion, extroversion, and so forth. So I would say that for myself, there are no specific limitations as long as you feel that what you're offering to children is appropriate for them and you are not overdoing it. I think we all have to a certain extent this kind of sensitivity to understand if we are overdoing it or not. And if you don't understand it from the very first moment, then if you always try to assess, observe, as I said before, then you'll reach the point to understand it eventually, and then you will actually remedy this kind of problem you will see eventually happening. So overstimulation, it's a bit vague as an idea, but then again, I'm pretty sure that this is something that if someone has it in mind, then they can address it in the best possible way. Obviously, playing is important, is one of the most important things, especially when we're discussing about infants. So the absence of play partners in the essence of DAP is unacceptable. You always need to be partners with infants, always try to create partnerships. When the months go by and the infants become more susceptible to relationships, then they might form partnerships with other infants as well. So this is peer learning, as we call it. So you need to enhance that part as well. So always keep in mind that the absence of that, it's inappropriate for DAP to be successful. And then last but not least is noise. Noise is very, very important, especially in the very beginning of life, the first 2 years of life. It's important to remember that in noisy environments, we have a lot of stress, we have a lot of blockage of learning, just because there is a masking of information, as we call it, that don't go through to children whenever we are needing them to go through. So we might see unresponsive infants, for example, not because they cannot respond or they cannot pay attention, as I was saying before, but just because the stimulus doesn't reach them in order to respond. And that might happen because we have a very noisy environment. And so we might see infants retracting from the group activities just because noise makes them feel stressed. So always remember that noise is something that brings negative outcomes, if not semi-positive, if I may say, or zero results at all in this environment. Now that we have actually concluded on the infant age range from 8 months to 24 months old, let's go a bit up the scale of the development, and let's discuss a bit about toddlers and how we can understand developmentally appropriate practice for toddlers. So, what are toddlers like? So they like to run, they like to walk, move a lot, climb. Now they reach, at this age, they reach to the point that they like to overdoing it. They like repeating and practice new activities. And most importantly, they like showing off. They like showing to themselves, to other people, to peers, to you as teachers. They like to show that they can achieve things. So, and through this kind of showing off, they are engaged in limited social activities. So if we actually take into consideration this kind of profile, we understand that toddlers, they need to be accepted for who they are. So it means that we shouldn't actually criticize them for what they're doing. I would say, in my personal opinion, I would say it's forbidden in this kind of environment. Never ever criticize kids in the kindergarten whenever they're doing something. Always try to see the positive side and always to be positive in your reward in how you're actually approaching them. You need to provide them because they ask for it, because they need it, a sense of autonomy. So they need to do things by themselves. They need encouragement to separate themselves from the group. This is why I was referring before to the individuality of the children inside the group, because eventually they have this kind of need of separation. So we need to consider that part of their being, of their profile. Of course, they want safety. They need safety, flexibility, organization, and this is where our goals and our objectives come to the fore whenever we are discussing about designing developmentally appropriate practices inside the kindergarten environment. And of course, they need to be challenged. So what kind of environments offer all that? These are environments that they support, obviously, autonomy, and I can give you an example where you can play specific play games that they offer the opportunity to see themselves, the children see themselves to be autonomous, explore, understand how they can react to something that they've done that they haven't done before. So having said that, they can actually create this kind of sense of separateness through specific games that they bring, this kind of individualized approach. They need to see themselves outside of the group, and obviously activities, environments that they bring a lot of movement through play or exploration. These are the best to support developmental needs for toddlers. Then it's all about creating environments that they support and scaffold self-help skills. So it means that it's not about us being there helping them do stuff. It's about us being there showing them the way for helping themselves to do stuff whenever they are asking us. It's completely different, if I may say, approaches. These two I just said. It's one thing, most people think that the facilitator helps children in classroom to do things, whereas in the developmentally appropriate practice, we are there just to show the path for the children to understand how they can help themselves. And of course, the very essence of development, as we said before, for the infant stage, that applies here as well. So we need to have environments that they promote sensory motor exploration. For these environments to be successful, first of all, we need to schedule them, and then we need to consider the transitions from one activity or experience to the other. So first of all, let's refer to the schedules. Routine, we know that provides a base of security, and that applies a lot in the developmentally appropriate practice. we need to allow for a wide variations environment that enhance ability and creates a lot of opportunities to see this kind of variations in practice, because when children actually explore, they don't just explore what is happening outside of themselves, they also explore what is happening inside themselves. So we need to be prepared and schedule for this kind of wide variations in ability. Then we need to alternate in between the quiet and inactive environments with active times. There needs to be a fluctuation in between the two and not having a constant into an active experience or an inactive experience. We need to always create variations on that. We need to create alternations so that children are not bored and their systems, biological systems, are rebooting in a way. So children, they have these ups and downs biologically, emotionally, more than adults have, because they cannot actually control their systems as we do as adults. So we need to give them space to relax, to re-energize, to reactivate themselves, to push themselves, and then relax again. So the more of this you have, the more you actually regenerate the process, and you create motivation for a child to participate in what you're offering them. How do we connect all this together that I've just said, in terms of the schedule, in terms of the content of this kind of schedule we are trying to offer in the app? So first of all, it's good to use non-verbal cues. I mean, especially at this age of toddlership, and of course infants up to this age range of toddlership, up to 3 years old, we cannot rely on a language all the time. So we need to create non-verbal cues for children to be able to absorb as much information as they can, so that they can understand transitions in time. We need to provide this kind of transitioning information well in advance, with plenty of warning before we do it, so that they can process it, they can understand it, and they can apply it when time comes. The pace of changing and implementing the transitions in every experience need to be a very slow pace, despite the fast profile of an activity. For example, always remember to take it slow until you reach a certain activity that has a very active profile, not because they cannot respond, but because then you don't consider the individuality of children, that they cannot follow up whatever you're asking them to do. So always try to be more considerate of a slow pace, so that everybody can follow. And most importantly, whenever you're transitioning from one experience to the next, always remember to eliminate waiting as much as possible in between the specific activities and transitions, because waiting kills motivation, kills the idea of moving forwards, and consequently kills development. So it's very, very important when you're scheduling DAP activities to actually try and eliminate waiting. What would be inappropriate in that sense, if you don't follow what I just said in my previous slide, would be completely the opposite idea. Obviously, to have restrictive environments, forbidden items not to be removed from inside the classroom. That brings a lot of trouble. Then if you have a large group area where a lot of kids actually take part in specific activities, then there is no reaction. Remember noise, as I was saying before. When you have materials and props and tools where kids need to pay a lot of attention in order to manipulate them and understand them, that's also kills in a way development into the physical environment. So try to bring easy stuff to explore in the first instance, and then as they grow older, then increase the difficulty of manipulation for the same material. There are a lot of people that they still use, unfortunately, this kind of timeout chair. Go to your corner there because this is a form of punishment and this will teach you to behave and so forth. Forget about that. That's an inappropriate practice. We know that in terms of neuroscience. It brings the stress levels to the upper limit of each individual. The effect is negative as of social interactions, relationships, and so forth. So it's something that you need to forget as of a practice if you really want to have a developmentally appropriate practice. Having a rigid schedule, on the other hand, I would say that it's not completely wrong, but then again, being too rigid, being too specific, that brings a little bit of inflexibility in the process. So don't be too stiff in the way you provide the schedule that you have created for kids. And again, what I repeated many times already, if you fail to recognize the unique needs of toddlers, then your DAP approach will be unsuccessful. Just because we are not only groups, we are also individuals, that we feed ourselves through groups in order to develop ourselves inside society. Now, we've seen how we understand developmentally appropriate practice for infants and for toddlers up to 3 years old. What happens beyond that? We do know that preschoolers, as we call them, I mean, from the 3rd year of life and on, we call them preschoolers in general. They are very, very physically active. Now you have kids in front of you that they can go everywhere, they can do everything. So they're very, very active. I'm sure you've seen that many times in your classrooms. They have developed conscience, so they understand what is wrong, what is bad, or they try to understand it in a way. They try to be competent and confident. So it's very important for them to try to be the best. It's very important for them to do something because they have to do it. They always burst with ideas, energy, and enthusiasm. Obviously, I mean, that's the main characteristics of children, and that's a good thing. Obviously, that's why in the end it's very easy to implement, according to what I have said already, developmentally appropriate practice, because they can actually lead us to this point to use all these kind of characteristics and features for their own benefit. And they always like to test their limits. So I'm sure again you have seen that happening in your classrooms. They always try to be better. They always try to explore the next level and try to challenge themselves. So based on that, on this kind of profile, what do they need? What do they need and how can we give them is what I'm going to analyze later. So what they need is a sense of initiative. So they need to take initiatives for themselves in order to thrive in the specific environment. They need to learn the basic behaviors of socialization, so they understand how we form relationships, what is anger, what is honor, what is actually keeping my promise, for example, and so forth. Sometimes some approaches or some concepts, they are more complex than the other, but that doesn't mean that they are not socially acceptable concepts and we shouldn't show them how they should react to it or how they need to integrate it in their relationships. So they do need this kind of information. They need to they start creating a sense of identity within the social context. And they need a lot of support to develop their self-control. So they need to have self-control because this way they can extend themselves from the safety or separate themselves from the safety environments they have behind them. But then again, if we don't teach them, if we don't show them more precisely self-control, then it's definite that they won't be able to thrive in the environment where we get the specific ideas of being if I may say, uh, susceptible to change and exploration. And then the last part, I would say, is that they need emphasis on the foundations for academic skills. I have already said in the very beginning that DAP is all about knowing the actual patterns of the academia as a wider sense and its patterns. So, starting from the very beginning in the kindergarten, we need to show them how we form the foundations for academic skills and how we actually use them later on. They need this kind of support, they need this kind of ideas to be discovered for them, and this is something we have to offer them, obviously, in the kindergarten environment. So, what would be the right environment to create this kind of support? Here we have, as you can see, in all this list of the 7 items I show you here, we have the 2 opposites all the time, and that's because of the characteristics of the preschoolers. They're very energetic, so we need to have the whole span of the actual let's say, shades of characteristics that we are going to discuss. So it's about softness and hardness. So you need to be soft, but then again, hard as well in terms of how you develop and design the curriculum, how you treat them, how you actually interact with them, because this is where they map this kind of different shades and the extension of one point to the other. Then we have the open-closed environments and open-closed ideas of an environment. Could be that it's a very strict environment of a room versus the open nature, so that needs to exist. Simple and complex, motivation and stimulation. So this needs to be included in the environments in various ways. Simple tools or complex tools later on, simple relationships or behaviors versus complex relationships and behaviors. Then we have the intrusion, going from the individuality to the group side of things, and seclusion, the other side, the other way around, being in a group, understanding that we are in a group, and then we are forming an individuality inside the group, and it's important to create an identity on that. And then we have high mobility and low mobility environments. Obviously, we need to give them the opportunity to have this kind of specific variations. Of course, risk and safety are paramount as concepts. Of course, safety is the first thing that needs to come in an environment of developmentally appropriate practice, and then slowly and gradually we provide them with the risk-taking opportunities. And then of course, we need the large versus the small groups to interact in the environment design so that we can achieve the best possible results in DAP. What would be the appropriate schedules based on developmentally appropriate practice for preschoolers? A good schedule should be predictable. It doesn't mean that it's stiff, it's strict in how it's implemented, but it's still predictable. You need to have, I would say, a compartmentalized approach of specific activities. They need to know that first a specific idea comes in terms of an activity, then something else, and then a third thing. And every day, or for the next 2 or 3 days, for example, that you are implementing this kind of scheduling, they know that more or less it will be the same idea applied, so that they can expand based on this kind of basis, this kind of idea. Of course, by and large, although you are predictable, then you have to be flexible as well. You need to leave yourselves and obviously your children in the classroom to deviate from what is scheduled, and this is where development actually happens. Then you need to remember that it's not only what you offer, but what kids offer as well inside the environment, so and in your schedule. So always look for child-initiated time blocks whenever there is the potential ground to do so. obviously, and leave kids to formulate whatever the activity might be, or wherever the activity might take them, for that matter. So it's always good to leave them lead whatever you are offering them, because this is how they construct knowledge, and this is how they create the idea of being themselves and creating their identity. Then again, I already said that a schedule needs to have active and quiet, indoor and outdoor balance, and differentiated learning experiences, of course. And remember that the pace goes hand in hand with your schedule. So always, whenever you are creating a schedule, designing a schedule, always try to remember that the pace is of a very important consideration for your children to react in time and take part in the activity, because they might want to take part in the activity, they might need to take part in the activity, but then if you don't have the right pace offering this activity, they might lose the opportunity to see themselves, and then they are blocking themselves outside of the activity, and this is where problems actually begin, and obviously no development happens when a child doesn't participate. And of course, I have already mentioned that a couple of times now, is that there are differences in the attention span of development. So whenever you have especially preschoolers in front of you where you communicate, don't expect them to pay attention in exactly the same way. Sometimes some of the mechanisms of attention inside the brain, inside the body, they're not fully formed yet, especially for the first 3-4 years of life. So try to be patient, because this kind of attentional performance it takes time to establish itself in a specific environment for a specific pace of providing activities and so forth. So don't blame them for not being able to pay attention. Try to understand if there is an issue with the mechanism, or if, of course, I refer their capability of paying attention to something, or if there is a masking approach that doesn't leave them to receive the information from the environment, or it's a lack of motivation. That might be the 3 different scenarios I have right now in mind that might bring differentiation in the attention span. Whichever the scenario might be, you need to be there, observe, and try to reflect on which one might be the case, so that you offer different opportunities, different ideas that they can grasp on, and create the pace they want, so that they can pay attention and create obviously the motivation for them to be this experience you're offering them valuable. Remember about the transitions. I just tried to repeat that here, because it's important to create the sense of transitioning from one activity to the next. Always remember to give advance notice of what might happen. The auditory and visual signals, they need to go hand in hand, because sometimes the integration of modalities is not very refined at that age level. So transitioning through signals that have to do with the visual modality or the auditory modality might help them create a balance in between the two, and then obviously follow the activity in a better way. You need to be clear and specific, but that applies, I guess, to everything in education, and especially when you have to do with children, that they are asking for specific directions, otherwise they're bored or they just don't pay attention at all. And whenever there is an issue with the waiting time, if I may say, in between transitioning, always try to create more of this kind of idea that you're using yourselves or assistants if you have, so that you can fill in. This is the deviation I was talking before on the schedule, and this is where you can get more out of the developmental side of things, because you have a continuity that brings a lot of momentum into the learning process. Now, having said that, remember that whenever you are transitioning from one side of things to the next, from one experience to the other, the children might be able to initiate specific activities. So in this way, you are actually reducing the waiting time if you accept that. And of course, you bring a better momentum without the need for you to intervene or an assistant. So it's important always to observe what is happening in the classroom and always try to understand if that's something that is offered from the children's side that is in favor of the activities you're trying to bring into the classroom. Obviously, having smaller groups is important again for transitioning. So the smaller groups you have, the more you can control transitioning for that matter. So it's more susceptible for the process and easier to understand it. And whenever you have assigned tasks, as we call them, for the transitioning time, then you can always expect for the transition to be smoother. So for example, if you remember to say that now we are moving from one activity to the next, we have specific ideas that bring like cleaning the room, for example, or tidying up our toys, or we are moving together to form groups for the next activity. This would be a transitioning period that actually can be assigned to specific preschoolers, to specific kids, and that might bring the sense of identity, for example, that we were discussing before, the sense of self-control, the sense of creating a specific pace as of their own expectations. So the transition becomes smoother just because you assigned this kind of transition to children to follow up rather than yourselves, and you're trying to develop this kind of idea of look, now I'm showing you what to do and you need to follow it. And of course, the more transitions you have, the more you need to review them, because less transitions bring more momentum, and that creates a flow into the idea of the educational environment. Based on that, we have some inappropriate physical environments for preschoolers, obviously. Don't try to be direct in your instruction. That doesn't work in the specific environments, especially for preschoolers. So leave them be. Try to be indirect. Try to schedule in an indirect way. Of course, that means that you shouldn't be dominating the time into the classroom. Worksheets, flashcards, and all this kind of stuff that we use later in our academic life, they don't work as well for preschoolers. So although you may present them every now and then, that doesn't need to be, the norm in your specific teaching process. Forget, as I said, the timeout chair, and don't offer models for artwork. And I'm bringing that up specifically as an inappropriate physical environment for preschoolers because there are many teachers that I've seen creating models, specific models, where they ask their children in the classroom to imitate in order to create artwork. And then you have disappointment, you have very specific demotivation processes happening just because they cannot achieve what they see. So try to be more flexible on that in your expectations on creating artwork in general, and don't bring specific models. Try make them imagine these models, or try make them explain themselves what they will see after they create the artwork, rather than just bringing a very specific idea in front of them and organizing their time, their efforts, and the result based on that kind of model. I hope based on this quite extensive and detailed approach, you understood how developmentally appropriate practice works in these three different levels, what it means, and how we understand it into the environment of the kindergarten. It gave you some, I hope it gave you some ideas of where you can rely on in order to create developmentally appropriate practice. As I've told you in the very beginning, the book that I used as a reference, it has a lot of information, a lot of details on how you can make your developmentally appropriate practice more practical in nature with a lot of examples. And we need obviously more than this hour to explain all these things in detail. But then again, hopefully you understood the big picture, how it works in between the three stages that we are coming across in terms of development: the infants, the toddlers, and the preschoolers. And if you have any questions, please do follow up on this specific email address I have on the screen, my email address. I would be happy to answer any questions you might have. And I hope to see you soon again in one of my lectures, either online or physically in the campus. Thank you very much. Have a good day and see you soon.